everyone to Compost One-on-One. This is brought to you by Great Park Neighborhoods and Farmscape. I am your community farmer, Mary Kate, and then Sarah, if you would like to introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, I'm Sarah, and I work with Mary Kate on the programming. And we are just so excited to be talking to you guys about compost today. It's one of my favorite topics. And we have a special guest with us today who we'll introduce a little bit later. But Tyler, do you want to just say hello for us and tell us who you are?
Yeah, hey everybody, I'm Tyler Watts. I'm a 7th grade science teacher, and I'm just really happy to be a part of this. Been composting for a few years now, so it's exciting to be here with you all.
Cool. Thanks.
Welcome. All right, I'll give it one more minute and then I'll get started with the presentation. All right. So again, thank you guys so much for joining. I believe you guys should see my screen with the presentation on the screen in front of you. So let's see if this works. There we go. Okay, so today, like Sarah was saying, we are going to talk about composting, and we're really excited about it and the magical properties and everything that is awesome about composting we will be going over today. So we'll start by saying and talking about what composting is and how you make it. We'll go into the different composting systems a little bit and what works best for you, as well as composting in your guys' community. And then we'll talk a little bit about compost application. And you guys met Tyler earlier, so we are going to do an interview with Professor Watts and his system that he has at his apartment, and then a little Q&A afterwards. So we are going to start off with a little composting quiz. It's going to be a super easy, super short poll that should hopefully pop up on your guys' screen. It's just true or false questions. And go ahead and fill that out. It's 5 questions. And we just want to see, get you guys thinking about composting. So I see that you guys are clicking your answers.
We'll give this about another 20 seconds.
Good.
Looks like we have a lot of experts in the room.
Yeah. Lots of good answers.
Awesome, and we are going to be closing this poll now.
Cool.
Great. So we'll just kind of quickly read through these. The first statement said composting is super time consuming and requires a lot of expensive equipment, which is false, which all of you guys pretty much answered false too. So that is perfect. If the compost reaches the right, I scrolled down too quickly. The 4 main components of compost are carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and water. And this is true for your most basic compost system. So good job on that, you guys. And then the next one was raw meat helps speed up the decomposition process, which was false. Good job. That was 100% correct on your guys' end. And then the next one was if the compost reaches the right temperatures, it can kill weed seeds. which is true. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then 5, your compost should feel damp like a wrung out sponge. And that is true as well. So awesome. It looks like you guys are already experts. So I hope I can teach you guys something new in this workshop. So 1, what is composting? So it's, in my mind, like an everyday magic, right? So the dictionary definition says, as you see on the screen, a process in which various organic materials that would otherwise be regarded as waste decompose into smaller organic compounds that make up compost. And that compost is rich in plant nutrients, beneficial micro and macroorganisms, and all of that good stuff. But in other words, and how we, or I would like to describe it as, is that it's a magical act of repurposing our food waste into a life-giving and beautiful soil component that helps us to grow the fruits and veggies that nourish our bodies. It's made up of many different components, one of which I would like to say is appreciation for the earth and the many things it gives us and what we would like to give back to it. So this little statistic tells us that there are 210 million tons of trash created by Americans every year. That's a lot of trash. And within these hundreds of millions of tons of trash, about 40% of that is actually food waste that goes to landfills. And when that food waste goes to landfills, which are actually anaerobic, they turn into methane rather than carbon dioxide. And methane is one of the worst of the greenhouse gases. So one thing that composting does is it takes this food waste and turns it into, rather than methane, it turns it into carbon dioxide, which then it can store in the soil, which is super cool. And because of this system that we have, where it goes from our house, from the grocery, or from the farm to the grocery store to our house, back to the landfill, it really creates this kind of like broken nutrient loop that doesn't use that waste to give it back to the earth and then re-mineralize and give nutrients to the plants that we are now growing. So what compost does is it turns it into a closed nutrient loop. That closed nutrient loop now takes that food waste and puts it back into our soil, back into the earth, to then help give our plants those nutrients, like I've been saying, that they need. And so one little thing that it says off to the side is that as a US household, we actually have about 650 pounds of compostable waste that we accumulate every year. So if we are able to compost that waste, we are reducing excess emissions by eliminating waste materials that decompose in landfills, and by also reducing emissions by not transporting that waste, and furthermore turning it into, again, and I'll sound like a broken record, but that nutrient-rich compost that stores carbon in the soil. So storing carbon in the soil is actually a really great way of performing carbon sequestration. So that is the process of capturing and storing atmospheric carbon dioxide in the soil, or well, not in the soil, but it is the general idea of capturing and storing atmospheric carbon. But composting is an effective way to sequester that carbon by storing it in the soil. So the Earth's soil can hold more carbon than the atmosphere or plant and animal life combined. And as you can see from the little picture on the right, we do store a lot in, above ground, as it shows biomass, the leaves, the branches, the trunks, the understory. But below ground, you see that there's like 54% plus the 5%. We store so much carbon. It's one of the largest carbon sinks that we have to utilize, which is, again, it's just that everyday magic that we can use and utilize.
Real fast before you keep going, why is it so important to sequester carbon?
Oh, of course. Thank you for that. So it's important to sequester carbon because, as our global warming happens and as our world is getting hotter and greenhouse gases are accumulating, we want to take that carbon and sequester it so that we do not have as much carbon in the atmosphere. I feel like Tyler might have a better answer for that as a science teacher, but it really helps our planet, and it contributes to, you know, the sustainability movement and really trying to maintain this earth that we have and continue the I don't know, all of that good stuff. um, yeah. So this is one of my favorite compost quotes. There's not many out there. I think that there should be more. But it says, "The ground's generosity takes our compost and grows beauty. Try to be more like the ground." Again, by Rumi. And you can do with that quote what you will. I think it's a beautiful quote that goes to show just how awesome and amazing our earth is and how we should be taking care of it. All right, so compost components. This was one of those true or false questions that we talked about earlier. The main 4 components of compost are carbon, which is that browns that you hear about, your greens and your browns. It is the browns, so it's like dead, dried material, and it is one of the most, if not the most important component of compost. It is the primary energy source for the microbes that are in your compost, and it is used, and well, I'll show you later in a couple slides exactly what that carbon is going to look like. And then we have nitrogen, which is the greens, right? So your browns and your greens, these are wet living materials and or, you know, any kind of food scraps that you have, that food waste that we were talking about earlier. And carbon and nitrogen create this beautiful accumulation that we say is best in a 30-to-1 ratio. And that sounds like a lot because it is a lot, but that's how it works best and is optimized for microbial activity. And then we'll move on to oxygen, which oxidizes the carbon, aiding in the decomposition process. You can get really sciencey and really nerdy with all of these components. And I am still a novice in learning about this as well, but I think it's super cool to learn about all of this stuff because it puts it in a new perspective. So I was learning that the oxygen and the carbon actually combined are what the microbes use to perform cellular respiration and create ATP for them to have the energy to frolic and play in the compost, so to speak, and to break down those other nutrients. And make them bioavailable for your plants once you are able to apply it. And then water, lastly is water. In the right amounts, it maintains activity. Again, going back to what we were talking about earlier with the true or false questions, you don't want it to be too soggy or too damp. You want it to feel like a wrung out sponge, just damp enough to keep all of that, those processes continuing. All right, so what to add? The meat of it, so to speak. Well, not meat, we'll get to that later. You don't want to add meat unless you're bokashi composting. So nitrogen, the greens, you can add your veggie stalks, you can add peelings, coffee grounds, fresh leaves, any other living or recently deceased plant material. And you know, you guys are in the compost club have seen how you add it to our compost here at GPN. And then you may have noticed that us here at Farmscape with the GPN composting add the carbon, which is the browns that we were just talking about. And this can be anything dead or dying, or not dying, dead or dried. So leaves, sticks, sawdust, rice hulls, straw, any other brown, dead, or dried up plant residue. So I put wet wood pellets in parentheses because that picture right down there at the bottom is actually what we use. It's a really compact, super absorbent way of adding carbon to the system, especially with the size that we have here. So if you ever see those in the compost and you're like, what is that? Those are wood pellets, and that is us adding the carbon to the whole compost system we have going on here. And then to answer a couple of your guys' questions, because I know you guys ask questions, prior to signing up. So you can compost larger seeds. It's not necessarily preferred just because they do take a really long time to decompose. And we'll talk about time frame later as well, and get to that later on. But again, it really just depends on your system, how active it is, how quickly those microbes are decomposing. So for the sake of our compost here, I would say it's not advised to really add those big seeds, but in larger systems where things are super active and working super quickly, it is okay. But like avocado pits and mango seeds are asked about, it just is something that wouldn't decompose great in this system that we currently have, but in other systems might work. And then some of you have also asked, how do I keep my food scraps from smelling? This is a tough one. There are many ways and you can research it and try to figure it out. But I would say one of the main things you can do is buy a countertop compost caddy, those ones that are already like pre-made. You don't have to, but they do have a charcoal filter in the lid that helps kind of with that smell and keeping it all contained within that bin. Some people also say that they freeze their scraps, which is totally fine. You can totally do that. For the purpose of ours here, it might kind of be weird temperature wise because you do want, you need a certain temperature in order for the process to actually, for the compost to be active and all of that good stuff. But you can freeze your scraps. And then lastly, you can also just like place it under your sink in a cupboard where you can close it up. I know in certain places, I think Seattle, you have to compost. So it's kind of like the law. So there are a lot of people who have tried to figure this out and make it work for them. So I would suggest any one of those options or just kind of looking it up and seeing what works best for you. So on to the next one, what not to add. So different composting systems obviously can accommodate different things. And we'll talk about that later with the bokashi composting. But for our sake, and again, the sake of our GPN composting, we say that it's probably best not to add any meat, any cooked foods, milk, eggs, fish, plastics, glossy ink paper, metal, produce stickers. These have harmful pathogens and bacteria that can rot in rats and mice and putrefy. And it just won't fully break down in the compost bin. There are certain things like, I'm sure you'll see most people will compost their eggshells, but here at GPN, we just err on the side of caution and we say that it's probably best not to compost the eggshells here because it really just depends on how active your pile is, if it gets to the right temperature and can really kill off all that bacteria. But we would rather, again, just be on the safe side and be able to give you guys back your compost no matter what. So we ask that you don't put in your eggshells. So that is about it for that. We are going now to move on to how do you add your compost? I came up with this little 3-word, I don't know what you would call it, but I just say check, chop, and drop. So first you want to check your compost items, check them so that everything that you have can be put in the compost bin. Are they allowed? Are there any non-compostable items on them, like a produce sticker, or one that I've missed a lot is like a plastic rubber band, if you have those around a flower bouquet or something like that. And then next would be chop. If you are composting larger items, say a full lemon, a full orange, a full potato, try to chop them up before putting them into the compost. And doing that increases the surface area, allowing the microbes to get to work much faster and really speed up that process, especially with a smaller system like what we have here. The faster the microbes can work, the sooner you get your compost and we can open up more bins. So that way you guys can add more compost to it. And lastly would be to drop. You want to add them to your home compost or your community composting system. So really quickly, I'm going to stop sharing. And let's see, can I be put on? I don't know if you guys can see me, but I actually have a lemon. It's an old lemon. So yeah, it doesn't need to be any crazy, any crazy chopping, but sometimes they say like a ½ inch to an inch pieces, but especially with citrus, just breaking up that peel even a little bit really helps open up the fruit for the microbes to be able to start decomposing it. It still smells really good actually. And yeah, I would just say as best you can, you know, even if it's a peel or some long green stalks, it's probably best just to kind of like chop them up like this before placing them in your compost bin, just like that. All right, so I'm going to go back to the presentation. All right, so the time frame, what we were talking about earlier with composting, there's so many different systems and so many different ways to do it that it really varies, and it all depends on your system, the system's environment. An active hot compost pile can take anywhere from 2 to 4 months, but a cold compost pile can take a year to 2 years. So it really just does depend. One rule of thumb when you're trying to check and see if it's done will be that you won't be able to recognize what was put in there in the first place. So you're not going to see those citrus food scraps. You're not going to see those old peelings. It'll smell like earth, which is actually called, there's a word for it, I think it's petrichor. And it'll be dark and crumbly, and it'll smell, I like that smell. It'll smell good, and it'll look like something that you want to put on your plants. You just can feel it. Oh, and when it comes to this, when you're checking to see if it's done, one thing that we do is you can actually sift it. We did this with the compost that is ready for the compost club. Recently, you can sift it, and those bigger, larger pieces you can actually put back in another system to continue to decompose. Because some things, again, like we were talking about earlier, just take a little bit longer than others. So we are going to hop into a couple different composting systems and chat a little bit about each, and then kind of talk about which one might be best for you. So there is cold composting, or simply piling any organic matter in a bin or on the ground and letting it decompose over the course of a year or two. No, it is not actually cold. I put a picture of a compost pile and some snow, but that's not really what it is. It's just kind of like people like chop and drop, and you know, you're just kind of saving it, letting it do its thing. Not really adding to it or optimizing the decomposition process. And then there's hot composting. So it's a method of composting in which the microbial activity, like I said, is optimized, giving you a finished product much quicker than cold composting. And most composting, I want to say, is hot composting. I could be totally wrong on that. But a lot of times, again, you're optimizing that microbial activity. So it gets hot, it kills off, you know, bacteria and pathogens. It really decomposes much quicker. And then there's trench composting, which is basically like you see in that picture, digging a hole or a trench in soil and dumping all your greens and browns and burying it with soil, kind of letting it do its thing. I've watched a few, I've never personally done this. I've watched a few videos on it, and it is really interesting to see that you like put your food scraps under the soil, and then you can come back a few months later and dig it up, and you're like, there's nothing here. It's totally gone, which is super cool. And then there is vermicomposting, which is basically letting worms do the work. So you're building a home for worms with a bedding material and feeding them finely or not so finely chopped up green matter. And to kind of walk through this a little bit, it takes up little space. It is great for apartment composting if you can find pre-manufactured bins with kits with everything that you need, or you can make your own with just plastic bins and a handful of other common household items. You do have these like living awesome worms to take care of. So the basics with the system are that you are taking care of them. So you're using, little to no citrus, very few to none woody or dry items. They do eat paper, but no coffee filters or tea bags. And like most other systems, no meat, dairy, or bones. So we have some more information on this, more resources if you guys want to learn more about vermicomposting. But these are some examples. So you can get, like I said, a kit with a bin that's pre-manufactured and really just like has it all ready for you to use. And you can also make your own at home. And then there are active piles. So you are balancing the proper carbon to nitrogen ratio throughout the pile, allowing for microorganisms to go into hyperdrive. Active piles can heat up to over 150 degrees and break down rapidly. So in regards to the heat, again, super sciencey, this compost pile goes through this almost like bell-shaped curve of heat where it starts out at like a decent temperature in this what they call the mesophilic phase, and then it goes into the thermophilic phase where, like it says here, it goes from 100 to 150 degrees, and this is when stuff really happens and starts breaking down and decomposing all of the carbon and nitrogen items that you have put in there. All right, so tumblers. This is actually what we use here at GPN with the Compost Club. It can utilize hot or cold composting. It's easy to turn. It's a fully protected system in regards to pests and vermin. So if that's something that you're looking for, they are most common home garden bins. They have like handles on the side that you turn. I'll show you guys in a second. That help you to aerate it because aeration is really important to get that oxygen into the system. We use Jora bins here, which is what you see on the screen. They're top of the line tumblers. They're built to last. They can hold a lot of more material than your average tumbler. We add, like I was saying, we add wood pellets to our bin as browns because they're smaller and compact, but really absorb a lot and have a lot of carbon in them. It's so, like it's saying, carbon ratio, it breaks down into a fine sawdust when remoistened. And these are awesome bins. They have this super thick insulation, which helps with the hot part of it. So it really helps to keep it hot, which keeps the microbial activity continuing and breaking down. So I will take you over there. I am quickly going to switch over to my phone. So forgive me for 1 second. I might have to be on presentation. All right, I am going to talk over to the compost and I will show you guys how that's done.
All right, while she's walking over there, I just wanted to say hello and see if anyone has any questions while she's walking over. You can take yourself off mute, raise your hand, or ask in the chat. I know you guys all asked a lot of questions beforehand, but now that we've kind of talked about it a little bit.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What are the thoughts on composting dried weeds?
Great. So I do think Mary Kate's going to talk about weed seeds in a little bit. In general, the only type of compost pile that you can put weed seeds in is the active compost pile. So it needs to get above, I think it's 130, but it might be 150 for the weed seed to actually be destroyed. Otherwise, you'll be propagating seeds in your garden, which, depending on where you're planning to apply it, may or may not be something that you desire. Does that make sense? I'll take that as a yes.
I have one question actually too.
Yeah.
Okay, and again, I'm trying to think of the best way to phrase this. So we just started composting. We built like a raised bed garden that has a little section on the corner with like a 2-bin system. Like, okay, we keep dumping in 1 bin and obviously layering and doing everything we're supposed to. But like, if something's ready on the bottom, I know we're turning it, but we're constantly adding it to it. So like, how do you know when you can pull out what's ready, or like, when are we in that position?
Totally. Yeah, typically, so I don't know the size that you're dealing with, but typically at some point you would let it rest, right?
Okay.
And so maybe you would pull that out and let it rest and then start your pile new. I have a similar situation. I have it's almost cold composting. I flip it like maybe once every 2 weeks. I'm pretty low maintenance with my compost. And I am such a lazy gardener. I actually just add it to the bottom of my garden bed during season switch. And then I let the weight of the garden and all that just kind of break it down. Now that does mean like I have an avocado tree in my garden bed, and I have surprise potatoes, and I have free onions and all kinds of things that come up. But that's my way of sort of saying like, okay, well, I'm not going to let this rest forever. I'm going to stick it underneath and then plant my garden on top. So that's one option. And again, I don't know how much space you have to kind of move things around, but
it's like, it's got 2 bins, so it's not huge, like you're saying, probably similar to yours. It's not huge at all, but it's divided. So I guess when things are started looking closer, or more dirt-like, you can put it in the other bin and then keep going in the first.
Exactly. And that's why they set it up with 2, or even sometimes they'll have 3, so one can rest while you're adding to the other one. And Mary Kay, it looks like you are where you are, so let's go back to you.
So this is the Jora composter here at Pavilion Greenhouse with the adorable GPN composters yes and no list. So I actually opened up both sides of the bin so you guys can see the difference. So I am not totally sure how long this has been in here for. I should have grabbed the temperature gauge, but yeah, so like you can see this compost, there's a couple of bigger, bulkier items in here that are taking a little bit longer to break down, but for the most part, it's starting to turn into that really crumbly, dark looking compost. And then over here, we have our younger compost with a lot of fuller, bulkier items in it. You can see some banana peels. You can see our wood pellets. This one, these are already starting to really like turn into that really fine sawdust that we told you guys about. And this one is super full. But as you can see, we actually closed it off at about the same size. So it does cook down. And so soon enough, you know, this will start to look like that. And then this will be ready to give out to the compost. So I am going to turn you back around. I'm probably going to head back if you guys want to continue asking questions.
You know, we're at 10:35. Oh. Hey. Any other questions? By show of hands, your digital hand or your real hand, who is already composting either through the community compost or at their home? I'm just curious. Of course, Tyler Watts is. Madison's halfway there. I halfway compost. That's sort of how I feel too. Nice. Mary Kay, is this a good time for Tyler to show his method of bokashi?
Yeah, actually, this is perfect. The next slide was bokashi. So
Cool.
Why don't we go ahead and have him show it? Because he knows way more about it than I do.
Great. GPN, will you spotlight Tyler for us?
Great. Yeah. I can't quite see the slide there, but I can just share. So I've tried a few different methods. What got me into composting was actually my students. So I was teaching at a high school, and we had students through this project-based learning come up with ways that they wanted to make a difference on our school campus. And so one of the things that the students had identified was that a lot of food waste was going into our trash. And so they wanted to make a change. And so what we started doing was vermicomposting. And so I had students look up the information on vermicomposting And I just want to encourage you too, if you are new to this, the good thing is that there's one, a lot of resources, but two, you don't have to be an expert to get started. That was something that was really refreshing, because my students actually, they looked it all up. They looked up how to make redworm composting bins. And I basically just sort of took care of the bill through our funding through school. So it is something that you can get into with it's surprising how little resources and knowledge you would need to get started. And then what's nice is over time, you start to learn some things, and it becomes a process that, just continually reveals more about what's going on. But what I ended up landing on is bokashi composting. And so why I got into bokashi composting is because with redworms, it was kind of hinted at before too. That's really cool if you're wanting to be very actively involved in composting, and it's a really neat sort of symbiotic relationship that you have with these, pets that you have. The downside is now you have about 1,000 new pets in your house that you have to, of course, take care of and find caretakers and all of that. And then also there are some things that make them sort of finicky pets, in that if you're giving them a lot of citrus, they can handle some. It's often said that, don't put any citrus peels, but when I've had them, they can handle small amounts. The bad news is if they get really unhappy, they will leave. And so I have some stories of, trying to redworm compost in my house and having my pets not be too happy with me, and finding red spaghetti all over my kitchen floor. So there are some downsides, and so you learn to take care of them better. And of course, I've also, I have a little sort of like closet area on my patio that, it can make it a little easier to manage that. But I was doing, redworm composting just underneath my sink. So bokashi composting, the benefit is that, you don't have to take care of the worms. They're not a pet. You actually just use this bran here. It's bokashi bran. And what it is just microorganisms that have been, added to, bran. I think they use like a rice bran for this particular company, but you can order it online, and you basically sprinkle it into your food waste. You can put in whole food waste that, I made this little bucket system. These are just 2-gallon food grade buckets from, a department or Lowe's, I think is where I got these. You drill some holes in the top bucket, which allows the moisture to sort of drain through to the bottom, and then you can just empty the bottom out every few days. And then you do a second phase, which you actually take. It's basically like a pickling, almost fermentation process. And so, it doesn't have a lot of smell. It does have some smell, but it smells almost like if you made, kombucha out of just like random stuff that you found. So it smells kind of like a random, kombucha, or if you made sauerkraut just from a bunch of branches of things. So it has a smell to it, but if you're doing it right, it has more of a fermented smell, which I actually really enjoy. So, but then the second phase, you bury it underground, much like the trench method that you had seen before that Mary Kate was sharing. And in about 4 to 6 weeks, that then becomes fully usable compost. And how now I know the term there, Mary Kate. I didn't know that term for, smelling, but I've always done, I've asked the students, okay, does it smell like forest or foul? And so that's what we usually go for, is like, they go, oh, it smells kind of foul. I'm like, not ready. So, so yeah, that's the method that I use. And I have just a patio garden. And so the burying method I'm doing are just in, like food safe totes that I have, just a soil that I put on top of it, and I kind of layer it. And it's surprising how much you can handle. But I've kind of gave myself a challenge for this year, when I, being home so much, that I haven't thrown anything away except for bones and like pits, like avocado pits, into my trash. Everything else has been composted in my 2-bedroom apartment with about I would guess 15 by 8-10 foot patio. So it's surprising how much you can do in a small amount of space, especially with the bokashi composting.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing.
Are there any questions about the bokashi system? I know that's sort of like a whole new world. but really great for when we're living in high density living circumstances. Okay, Mary Kate, take it away.
I'm going to go back to sharing my screen real quick. So we were just talking about the bokashi composting, which is super cool. And as Tyler was talking about, one of the amazing things in from my experience, or from my perspective, I guess I should say, is that you can compost meat and dairy and other byproducts that you cannot do in any other compost system, which is amazing and super, super cool. Oh, and then there was one more system just before. I think you guys are talking about this while I was walking over there, multi-bin systems, right? So each bin just has a certain 4x4x4 pile. Doesn't have to be that, but it allows for hot composting. And then the bokashi, which you just talked about. So which system is best for me? So depending on where you live, vermicomposting or bokashi composting, it's Professor Watts is just saying maybe all you have space for. If you have a backyard garden, you may want to step it up to a tumbler or a single or multi-bin system. Also, depending on how much compost you would like to get out of it too, right? So how much space you have in your garden, how much compost you would like to add to it, and all of that good stuff. One thing I think is super cool to talk about is that one of the ways that you can help your compost is by thinking like a microbe, right? So they are your best friend when it comes to composting. And if they're happy, your compost will be thriving. So with composting, you really want to stay consistent with it. A good compost pile or bin shouldn't smell super foul. It will produce a wonderful product that your soil and plants will love. So composting in my or your guys' community, we have the GPN composting. So for those of you who are not in the compost club, this picture is of our compost tumbler over in Parasol. It is the Great Park neighborhood collects and manages the tumbler compost bin at the, like I was saying, the pavilion and the Parasol gardens with the compost club. So you add in your food scraps whenever you want to. There's usually one bin at every point that is open where you can add your food scraps. And then we manage it by adding the carbon to it and turning it, adding that aeration and getting it moist, making sure it is looking good and maintaining its activity. And then at the end, when it's done, you can actually pick up the finished compost. So if you are interested in joining, feel free to reach out. I believe at the end of this, you guys will get an email and there will probably be a link of some sort that you guys can join to learn more about the Compost Club. And then Irvine composting. One of the questions that was asked prior to this workshop was, when can we get an organic added to the route, to our trash bin route? So the city of Irvine is actually starting a citywide compost program that they are hoping to launch mid-2022. The program will start with businesses and hopefully with some trial runs be able to add residential neighborhood homes to their route as well. I think I talked about Seattle a little bit earlier. This is something that they do there. And I think would be super cool if we were able to find a system that worked. All right, so compost application. This varies. Again, I mean, it's all really dependent on a lot of different things, whether you have raised beds, pots, ground beds, anything really. If applying to the top of the soil, most things that I read said you want to add at least 1/4 to 1/2 inch of compost on top of the soil that you can kind of work into the first few inches, depending on how much compost that you have. If amending the soil, you can add like 1 to 2 inches. There are actually compost calculators out there you can use that get really scientific with it. Compost is not exactly the most, that's not the word I want to use, but you do want to use fertilizers along with compost. It's not going to add everything to your garden, but it'll definitely help and it'll definitely improve, you know, your soil structure. It'll help you to retain moisture. It introduces all those micro and macro organisms that are so important to creating really healthy soils. All right, and then we did our interview with Professor Watts, and then these are some more resources. You can read, if you want to learn more about vermicomposting, there's a book called Worms Eat My Garbage, which I heard is great, as well as Teaming with Microbes, which is about, soil structure and how that whole, system of microorganisms works and really helps our soils. And then there's some websites that you guys can use that I have found really useful, as well as a little compost calculator I found online, if that's useful to you guys. So lastly, we'll have a little Q&A. I think we already did ask some questions. So if you guys have any more, feel free to unmute yourselves or put it in the chat, because we are about 10 minutes out. And thank you everyone for joining. I hope you guys all learned something.
Do you see that question, Mary Kate? Can we add moldy produce?
Moldy produce. Yeah, you can add moldy produce. So it will actually be and or get moldy even in the compost. But again, with that heat, it'll likely heat up to a high enough temperature that all of those bacteria and pathogens will be killed off. Oh, and we were going to talk about the weed seeds, which was something that was mentioned and asked earlier. Sarah pretty much answered it. You do want to make sure you're getting to a hot enough temperature, and it was, I believe, 130 degrees at minimum. So if it doesn't get higher than that, it won't kill them off, and then they will continue as you reapply to your garden. Those weeds will continue to show up. So you want to make sure you have that optimized temperature.
Another way of avoiding weed seeds is to pull your weeds before they flower. That's my #1 goal in the garden. Pick them before they flower.
So it can attract, the question was asked or said that with composting, I read that smells from an outdoor compost can attract animals who then dig up the compost or get into the compost bins using it as their food. Is this accurate? And if so, how do we avoid this? So with different systems, it's different, right? So with some of these bins, they are really securely locked, and critters would have a super hard time getting inside of them. If you have, say, just an active pile, it is likely that you're going to find some critters in there. I myself, in some of the multi-bin systems we have seen, not here at Irvine, but at other sites, have seen like little mice and things. And it really just is part of nature. So if you want to, with those multi-bin systems, you can set it up so that way there are mesh, like wire mesh, that will keep out most, if not all, of those little critters that you would see. And then if you have a smaller system like that vermicomposting or the bokashi, it's in those bins, it's in those buckets that are hopefully pretty closed off. So it would be hard for them to get in.
If we have traps, how do we go to Castle Park and to put them inside the compost bin? Like, do we open the bin ourselves, or do we ask someone to open it for us?
You can open the bin yourselves. Thank you for the question. So wherever there is a bin that is open, there's actually a little lock combo that you can, when you join the compost club, they will give you that lock combo and you can open it up and you put them in there yourself. And then if you can try and turn it. It might be super heavy, but you can try to get it so you guys can get a little feel for what aerating it is like.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And then Lisa asked, how do you know if the compost is balanced? Add more browns versus greens. There are a lot of different signs. So if it is for liquidy, you probably don't have enough carbon in there and enough browns that are absorbing the liquid from the nitrogen that you've added from your greens. So that's one sign. Another sign is the smell, right? So maybe too much nitrogen, too many greens, or not enough oxygen, they say, is sometimes one of the reasons why it might smell or have that putrid kind of fragrance to it. So yeah, you just want to like keep an eye on it. If anything is starting to seem off to you, maybe, you know, do some research, look it up, see why that might be happening. But those are I would say, the most common things that you might see.
If it's not breaking down at all, right?
Right.
Yep.
Or if it's not breaking down at all, especially with the temperature, you could get a little temperature gauge and check it every once in a while to make sure it is heating up, because the process of it heating up is going to show you that the microbial activity is happening, which means that the decomposition process is starting and or happening.
And then Aiko asked, is it normal to have fruit flies?
It is very normal to have fruit flies. It happens all the time. But I will say, for a lot of people, they've said what helps is you can, what I talked about earlier was freezing it. If you freeze your compost, your food scraps, that helps mitigate that fruit fly issue. All right, thank you, everyone. One more message. Okay, awesome. Any more questions?
And then Great Parks just is reminding everyone, if you are not already part of the Compost Club, that you can visit the resident website or email the club coordinator, and the email is in the chat that's available to you, and you can join the Compost Club. So we encourage you to, whether you're going to use the community compost or if you're going to be composting in your own home, you can get support and inspiration and meet your fellow composters, other people who see the magic of composting and adding to our nutrient cycle. All right, I think that's it. Well, thank you, everybody.